Writing rules in ListenLayer is one of the most powerful things that you can do. We can take existing data layer activity as well as values from browser storage, and we can use those to create conditions that then push other information into the data layer when something happens. Now, before you start writing your rules, it's important to note that we need to create actual variables to push values into. And those are created under global settings. You can see here we have a few of them created: form name, form category, conversion type. All of these we use in various examples. And to create a new one, we simply click the plus sign here and type in new variable, save it. Let's jump back to the HubSpot Forms custom values screen and start writing some rules. Now, regardless of which listener you're actually working on, writing rules operates in the same fashion. We're going to create a new rule set here, and we're going to choose between simple and lookup. A simple rule allows you to write a single condition and push one or more values into the data layer. A lookup rule allows you to write multiple conditions and have multiple outputs from those conditions. Once we have a single rule, we can create additional rules. And those rules will be listed in order on this page, and we can actually change the order of those. So we'll take a look at that in a second and talk about how it works. So we're going to go through a quick example. We're going to categorize demo forms. So let's assume that over here on our test website, we have multiple forms, and one of them is a demo form. It's this one that I just submitted here. And when I submitted this, because I have the HubSpot listener turned on, we already have some data layer activity coming through. You can see HS form submitted. Now, as you start to use ListenLayer and you start to get familiar with all of the data layer activity, you'll be able to identify ways in which you might customize or enhance your implementation. In this case, I know that the form ID is a clear identifier of, at least for how I have my HubSpot form structured, what that form is for. If you're using another form system, sometimes like Marketo or one that has maybe more of like a global form kind of structure, you could maybe use the form ID as well as the form location, which page it's on, and that will be listed down here in the data layer. You could actually even have information in hidden fields inside of a form and use those to drive data layer activity. But in this case, for simplicity, we're going to use this particular form ID to identify this form as a demo form. And we're going to push that into the custom values section of the data layer. So if we scroll down, there's this section called form custom values, and there's nothing in this at this point. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look for a variable called form ID. I'm not finding it. And here it is. So I searched, I found it here as form ID. Now, if you're having issues finding the variables that you need here, it's important to note that those appear under variable settings. And ListenLayer accumulates all the variables that it pushes into the data layer into variable settings. So if, for example, you're looking for form ID and it doesn't appear here, it's probably because the listener hasn't actually seen it yet. And that's actually why over here, I've already loaded some forms and I've submitted some forms. And so ListenLayer has this piece of information. Let's take a look at what those variable settings look like here. We're going to go under form field values, and we're going to look for that form ID. Oh, and it's actually here. It looks like it's above those form field values. Now, if I hover over this I, you can see the path to this form automatic values dot form ID. We'll go back up here to our form ID. You can see it's form automatic values dot form ID. So that's a reference to this field. I'm going to rename this inside of my interface just to make it a little bit easier to find. And now I'm going to jump back to my custom value rules, and I'm going to create that simple rule again. So we're going to look for that variable. And I renamed it so it's a little easier to find now. And if this is equal to that form ID that we copied, then we want to do something. Let's say we're going to categorize this form. We're going to call it a demo form. Now, I just breezed through a few quick items. So I'm going to go back and I'll spend a little bit more time looking at those after I save this rule. Once I save it, I can always turn it on and off, and I can edit it. Taking a look at our conditions, we can create individual rule sets, and then we can add them together. So for example, we could have this or something else, and we could have a whole nother rule set down here, this or this. And you can structure your rules in as complicated of a fashion as you need. Although in most cases you can get by with something that's relatively simple, like what I have here, where we're just looking at a specific form ID. Now, once that condition is matched, we want to tell the system a value that we want to push into a variable, again, that we have defined up here in our global settings. So here we want to label this form as a demo form. But we could do other things. For example, we could actually insert variables from the data layer and push those back into the data layer. We could insert a function such as a timestamp. Or we could actually use browser storage and push that into the data layer, which becomes extremely powerful because we can store things like a GCL ID, and then when a form is submitted, we could actually push that back in the data layer and capture that, or even populate fields with it. In this case, this simple rule is just going to categorize this particular form as a demo form. And I'm going to publish this. We'll take a look at the result, and then we'll dive into a more complicated situation where we're going to write a larger rule set in a lookup table. So here, let's go ahead and do a hard refresh. Make sure we get our latest version of our code here. And we're going to find that particular form ID. Let's go back to it and make sure we know what it was. It's the one that starts in D15. And here it is, D15. And notice now my form custom values has form category is demo. I must have a space after the demo. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to edit that. I'm going to delete that space. Now, notice that the event I'm looking at here in the data layer is just the form load. It's not the actual form submission. And that's simply because in my condition, I did not differentiate between the event or events inside this listener. When I want to push those values, I simply focused on the existence of a variable. So we don't have to specify an event. If we don't want to specify an event, then this rule will apply to all the events inside of this listener. But of course, I could say, I only care about this when a form is actually submitted. And if I were to save this condition here, then this would not appear because I'm looking at a form load and not a form submission. We're going to remove that and we'll save our rules. Now, what if we want to get a little bit more advanced here and say we want to create a lookup rule? Now, a lookup rule is a little bit different. We're going to call this form categorization. This is one of the most powerful things that you can do inside of ListenLayer. And what this is going to allow us to do is write conditions around a set of fields in a table format and push multiple values into variables based on those rules. And this will make a lot more sense after we build the table. So the first thing here is I'm not actually going to write my condition. I'm just going to select the fields that I want to use in my condition so that it can build the table for me. So what I care about in this case is form ID, because again, I want to categorize based on form ID, but we could list multiple things. So I'm going to include what's called origin and path, if I can find it. We'll see if this exists. Oh, I think we've renamed it to form location. So back here in my variable screens, I've probably renamed origin path to form location. And then after I've selected what I'm going to eventually write conditions around, I'm going to select what I'm going to use to push values into. In this case, I want to categorize my forms and I want to name my forms. Now, these variables, again, come from my global settings. And the condition fields up here come from my data layer activity, which are both events and variables. So I'm going to hit save and it's going to build me a table. I'm going to add a few rows so you can see what the table looks like. And on the left side, we have a set of conditions. If these conditions are true, then we're going to send these values to my data layer. Now these conditions have operators, so we can do an and or an or here. And then they have operators here that apply specifically down the line. And what happens here is the rule will be read, the table will be read from top to bottom. And as soon as a value is met for a variable, it will stop. And so if you ever wanted to write a more specific rule to apply to something that's more detailed, you would want to put it above a more generic rule that is not going to, that is then not going to apply because the rule above it will apply. And I kept form location here just for the sake of illustrating that we can write a pretty complicated rule. So my form location, I'm just going to say that I want it to contain demo, but understand that if you had a single form that did multiple things across multiple pages, we could use this to identify those things. Okay, and over here, what I need to do now is I need to get all of my form IDs. So here we're going to grab a few of our IDs and we're going to start pasting those over here. And now based on the ID, remember this one is my demo form, we're going to actually categorize those forms. And this can be really powerful because then the values from your data layer can be pushed into your analytics platforms. They can be used to key specific conversions. There's a lot of different things that we could do with those. The point of this video, though, is just to walk through how to actually write rules. So in this case, we're going to remove this one here. And we're going to put what's called a catch-all rule at the bottom. And I'm going to mark regex, which means I want regular expressions to apply to this rule. And here, we're going to start categorizing our forms. Let's say this is a content form. Let's say this one is a demo form. Let's say this one is a contact us. And let's say this one is a newsletter. And then we could give it a name. So maybe this is our ebook. Maybe this is our main demo. And actually, let's assume that one of these forms, let's assume we have one other form here, just to illustrate a point. I think we actually do. And this one is also a demo form, but this is going to be our pop-up demo. Okay. So what we've done now is we've built a pretty advanced rule set. And what this does is it's going to look at the form ID and the form location. It's going to read this table from top to bottom. And once it finds a match, it's going to return these values into the data layer. And if it doesn't find a match, it's going to go all the way to the bottom. And this catch-all rule is going to say anything else that has a value here and here, let's put unknown into the data layer. And we're going to save this. And now, notice that I have two rules. And because this lookup rule is new and I kind of want it to apply before the simple rule, I'm going to put it on top. And now my simple rule is going to apply at the bottom. I'm going to save that change. And just to illustrate that point, we're going to edit this simple rule and we're going to say demo simple. We're going to put just a different value here so you can understand how the ordering works. And now we're going to publish our changes. And we'll go back over here to our data layer activity. And notice that some of these forms, they're not going to have any custom values in them. But once I refresh the page, they're going to start to have custom values populated into them. Because now that we have that lookup table, we have rules written for every single one of these forms. So now let's jump back to our data layer activity. We'll notice we are automatically getting categorization. So here's our newsletter. Here's our form category. Now, nothing is hitting this simple rule at this point because we have a table up here that comprehensively looks at all of the forms and it returns a value. And so nothing actually gets down to this simple rule. But if we were to put the simple rule on top and save the changes and publish those again, then what we're going to see is that original form of ours is going to be categorized a little bit more differently. It's going to be categorized based on this rule. So we're going to find this value now for the D15 ID, we're going to find demo simple. D15. Now we see demo simple. So you can see how the order of the rules can be extremely powerful, although we're just looking at a very basic and simple example here. Now, let's take this a little bit further and write a rule that allows us to push a timestamp into a form submission. So every time the HS form submitted occurs, I want to put a timestamp into one of my variables. Now, in this case, I unfortunately don't have a variable for a timestamp. Actually, I do. Here we go, conversion timestamp. Now I was going to say this is why it's important to jump back to your global variables and make sure that you have your kind of plan set out and you've created all your variables that you need. In this case, let's go ahead and we're going to insert an ISO timestamp. We're going to save that. And now if you think about it, this timestamp rule is not for the same variables as these two, so it doesn't really matter where it's at. We're going to go ahead and publish. We're going to test out the timestamp. And now remember, we have to actually submit a form for this one to work. We're going to go ahead, we'll submit a form. We have our HS form submitted event over here. And we can immediately see that we have a timestamp now in ISO format. So let's take this a step further. If we scroll down to our URL parameters listener, and we go to custom values, we have a lookup table that we've built. And what we've done here is we've instructed our internal marketing team to put a specific URL parameter or a set of URL parameters into or onto their URLs whenever they visit the site so that we can identify them as test users. And notice we have 3 variables. So if I want to know what these variables are, I would jump to my variable screen and I'm going to find this test user identification variable 1, 2, and 3. So we'll scroll down and we can see here we have test, test user, test user. So just to make this clear, what's happening is whenever somebody uses these URL parameters in their URL, then we're going to do something with those based on this lookup table. And if you want to dig into exactly how this is set up, jump into the URL parameters listener, look at the custom data layer values and the browser storage, and watch these two videos. But let's see if we can understand this table. So when these URL parameters contain true, all lowercase, we're going to return yes. And if they contain true with a capital T, we're going to return yes. And if they contain true with an all caps, we're going to return yes. So what we're doing basically is we're building some flexibility into the system for misspellings and things like that. And what we've basically asked the user to do is, hey, if you are a test user, please throw test equals 1 or test equals yes onto your URL string. So here I have test equals 1. So what I should actually see is I have a URL parameters event here. And when I look at the data layer activity, it identifies this person as a test user. And that's because the variable test user is being populated with the value yes. And that's occurring right here. So then that helps you to kind of understand generally what's occurring here in this table. But let's look at browser storage now. We have a rule inside of browser storage. And what we're actually going to do here is whenever that test user variable exists inside of the data layer, meaning it's a custom variable in the data layer, we're actually storing it in browser storage. Now this is a local storage rule, so we're storing it in local storage. So let's go back to our website here. We're going to look at local storage and we see the value yes. And so what's occurred here is that this person is a test user. They put that on their URL parameter. We push that custom value into the data layer based on a set of rules that we wrote in a lookup table, which is what you're learning about in this video. So it's good to kind of see those and dissect them. And then furthermore, we're saving it into local storage so that it will persist over time. So now we know that this person is a test user and we can keep track of that over time. So all of that to kind of jump back to HubSpot Forms and go back to our custom values and realize that we can write a rule. Let's write a simple rule here that identifies test form submissions. And every time a form is submitted, we want to tell Google Tag Manager or through the data layer, we want to communicate that fact by getting the value from the test user storage key that we save down here in URL parameters, and we're going to push that into the data layer. And I realize that's a fairly advanced example. Again, go to the URL parameters listener and watch those two videos, and you'll be able to catch up to this. But the point that we're illustrating here is that you can get values from browser storage and you can push them back into the data layer. It's just another example of how we can use these rules. So we're going to identify test submissions. Okay. So now we're going to go here. We're going to refresh the page. And we actually need to submit a form. So let's go ahead and submit this form. And we should see now that the value from browser storage has been pushed back into the data layer. This value comes from this test user value right here. So by customizing our data layer with structured rules, we're able to then control our measurement strategy. And by doing it in a flexible way, like using a lookup table to capture different misspellings and things like that, we can make it even more flexible. Now, we could also look at specific information in a form submission and use that to push values into the data layer. But in this case, our primary goal is just to look at how we write rules. So let's recap that. So first and foremost, when you're writing rules, you need to understand that you have to be writing a rule for something. So you're going to need that variable to be built and defined initially. The second thing is that we can write multiple rule sets just like this, and we can change the order that they apply in, and they're read from top to bottom until a specific value is found for a variable because of a condition is matched, and then it will stop. Next, it's important to note that we can write these simple rules or the lookup rules. Simple rules are quite simple. We're simply defining a condition and outputting one or multiple variables, which is one thing we didn't look at, but you could populate multiple variables based on a single condition. And the next option is a lookup table, like this, where we can have either very simple or advanced conditions on the left-hand side, and we're returning values on the right-hand side. And again, these are read from top to bottom until a match is found. And so we have powerful features that can be driven based on having wildcards at the bottom of these. For example, we can take our newfound knowledge in rule writing, and we could notify ourselves every time we have an unknown form on our website. And let's just illustrate that because it is an extremely valuable thing. So let's delete a couple of these so that a couple of our HubSpot forms are no longer being identified. They're going to be returned now as unknown. So we're going to save this rule. And we're going to jump into monitoring. And we're going to write a rule called unknown form loaded. Every time this condition is true. And what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be looking for a custom variable. It's that form category. And when it contains the word unknown, which was the value at the bottom of our lookup table, we're going to do something. We're going to maybe notify ourselves, for example. And in our message, we can actually write custom values. So we can write our message to ourselves saying, hi, an unknown form was found. But then we can actually insert values from our data layer. For example, we could get that form ID. And we could get that form location. And now every time a form loads on our website and it has an unknown status, we're going to get an email notifying us of that information, which is really cool because then we know that somebody published a new form on our website, or that something exists that hasn't been caught up correctly by our rules. We're going to save this. And immediately, we should have some forms here that have an unknown categorization. And these forms should result in an email being sent to us, notifying us of that new form. And you can see here just a couple seconds later, I've already received a notification about one of these forms loading on my website. Writing rules is most definitely the most valuable aspect within the ListenLayer platform once you get beyond the basics. Truly, the sky is the limit, and almost anything that you can imagine in your head can be structured within these rules to help enhance your measurement strategies.